Good morning. My name is Michael Morris. I'm the superintendent of schools here in the Amherst-Pelham Regional School District, and we want to thank you for joining this town hall. We've had some earlier this summer, and as our plans develop, we want to continue to update the community and our plans. Our goal today is to share an update on the plans that were submitted to DESE. We know we emailed them out, and it was a very long document, so we're trying to condense to the key points. But most of the time, we want from this 9 to 10 today to be focused on questions and answers. Before we do introductions, I just want to note in the chat there, we have put there's a live translation, and so if you go to that link, you can pick the language and be able to participate both in terms of hearing this, the live translation, but also question and answer that someone will share back with us throughout. That's also that comment box is when we get to question and answers where you can ask questions, and a moderator will be helping us with that and trying to get groups of questions answered so that we can be, again, communicating accurate information to our community. With all that introduction, I'm going to turn it over just to do introductions. So we'll go in order. So I'll start with, to my right, with Principal Slovin.
Hi, I'm Dave Slovin, Principal of Summit Academy. Welcome.
Thank you, Dave. Ms. McDonald.
Hi, I'm Allison McDonald, and I am the chair of the Regional School Committee.
And Ms. Consolino.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jill Consolino. I'm the nurse manager for the school district.
Thank you. And Mr. Sadiq.
Good morning. Talib Sadiq, the interim principal at Amherst High School.
And Mr. Sharon.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diego Sharon. I'm the principal of the middle school.
Thank you. And Ms. Richardson.
Good morning. My name is Katie Richardson. I'm the coordinator of English language education.
And Dr. Brady.
Good morning. I'm Faye Brady, and I'm the director of student services for the district.
Thank you. So we took about a 102-page document, I think, which was submitted to DESE. We condensed it to about 10 slides, more or less. We're going to skip over the elementary because this is focused on the regional school, the secondary K-12, 7 through 12 schools this morning. And we'll roll through some slides that, again, are the highlights, and then spend most of our time in the question and answer today. So I'm going to pull up those slides, hopefully effectively. And okay, so again, this plan was submitted a little over a week ago to DESE as required about opening and reopening for fall 2020. So here are some of the important facts about the opening of school, especially at the regional schools, the secondary schools. The majority of our students and staff will begin the year remotely with a much more robust distance learning program than what happened in the spring last year, which was really an emergency distance learning program. In-person learning or hybrid will be introduced based on a phasing plan we'll talk about in a minute. And we'll use public health metrics to guide our decisions at all times. And really importantly, all families have the choice of full remote learning or in-person hybrid learning for their children. Last week, we had what I found to be a very informative session with 4 medical professionals who work in Western Massachusetts. And I think one of the statements that stayed with me is the choice that you make for your child is going to be the right choice for your child. And we know this is a very unusual time with the pandemic and with other factors. And we're trying to give the most accurate information so families have the best information to make that individual choice. And that's really what we're focused on today. So what you can see here on the phase reopening plan is our school year for all students, whether in person or virtual, will start on September 16th. And based on state guidance and what we know about who has better access or less access to distance learning, we would start with the priority groups to be in person at that time. And those groups are in the secondary level, students who are without a permanent residence under McKinney-Vento law, specialized special education programs, and beginner ELL students. And so those would be the only students at the middle school and high school who would be starting at the beginning of the school year under this phased reopening plan. And the metrics we would use would be that fewer than 70 confirmed cases per 100,000 people in our area, and a test positivity rate of for COVID below 3% in our counties, Hampshire and Franklin County. And I think it's important to note that the school committee and the staff really worked on this the metrics and what we would use for metrics to make this work. And importantly, we use the most conservative metrics that were recommended by reputable places. This is below the expectations, or more stringent than the expectations of the CDC and the World Health Organization and other states. And so we wanted to make sure that we were using, again, very conservative numbers. And so the second phase wouldn't involve the region, but after Veterans Day, when we get to November, we would be looking for 7th through 12th grade students to return 1 day a week. So it would be a hybrid model where they'd have 1 day in and 4 days of virtual instruction. And then assuming things are continuing to go well, we can revisit that after the first semester to go perhaps up to 2 days for our secondary students. The school committee did revote a calendar last week, I think on Thursday night. The first day, again, for all students in terms of education would be September 16th. A couple important notes is that we would not have snow days next year. We would just flip to virtual education. The school committee did decide to have an extended December break, December and January winter break. And that was really for people to be able to visit family. We knew that they needed an extended time period given the current situation. And the last day of school would be scheduled for June 24th. And so I'll go over some health and safety considerations. Again, there's a long document. We just picked on a couple of the most important ones that we continue to follow the CDC, the Center for Disease Control recommendations in terms of custodial protocols. One of the things that we learned in conversations with public health experts was having a shortened school day schedule will allow for enhanced cleaning and sanitizing. So at this region, that means school would start at 9 o'clock in the morning instead of 7:45. And end at the typical time. It allows for sanitizing and cleaning after students leave as well as before they come. So we have 2 shifts where that can happen. All classrooms will have HEPA air purifiers with UV disinfecting light that's been recommended to us. Really turns over the air in the room with fine-grained filters incredibly more often than if we didn't have those installed. Bathrooms, other high-touch services, door handles will be cleaned multiple times throughout the day. We've increased our supply of cleaning materials and supplies to make sure we're keeping up with things. One of the things the school committee early on suggested was, while the state recommended at least 3 feet of social distancing, that we were choosing 6 feet. And that really had implications at the regional schools. We can only fit about 15-ish desks in rooms at 6 feet, and that really drives some of our decision making, but we think it's in the best interest of the health and safety of our kids and staff to have that. The middle school has a lot of rooms without windows, and we won't be using those for student instruction. We want to have rooms that have the opportunity for natural airflow and natural ventilation as much as possible. We have purchased tents for all of our buildings, actually 3 tents for the high school and Summit Academy combined, and 1 tent from the middle school, because while the weather holds, we want to have as much outdoor learning as is possible. We've also contracted with HVAC experts to test all of our rooms that will be used in this phase 1, and then eventually more of those rooms prior to the opening of school. And they'll start this work at the end of the week. In terms of health and safety considerations, again, there's a long list. We picked on some that we were selected some that were the most relevant. All students and staff who are medically able will be expected to wear a mask. We've purchased significant amounts of PPE in the thousands, I think in masks in the 100,000s for the district based on the guidance we received from the state. For some students, we know that special face coverings for their staff need to have clear mouths. So we've purchased those as well. We talked about the physical distancing. Transportation will also look different. There'll be fewer students on buses and vans, and we're getting feedback now on how many families in phase 1 will transport their own child. But it'll be essentially 1 child to a seat as opposed to our typical expectations for filling up school buses and vans. Entry and exit protocols will be different. We won't have lots of students huddled. If you know the high school, if you go early in the morning, you'll see at the front entrance there's students, and this way will be a much more controlled entrance and exit for students and staff. We also have each building having a designated medical waiting room that's different from the nurse's office for anyone who is suspected to have symptoms or shows symptoms of COVID-19 to make sure we're keeping our schools as safe as possible. At this point, I'm going to skip the elementary schedules. I think I'll turn it over to Principal Sharon, who will talk about the in-person draft schedule at the middle school. So Principal Sharon, whenever you're ready, you can walk us through this.
Of course. Thank you. So I guess I want to start by differentiating that the schedule that we've created for online learning is a bit different than the schedule we're creating for in-person learning, and a lot of that just comes from the fact that we have since we're going to be spending about 1 day a week in the school in November, beginning in November. It's important to us that that day be not only developmentally appropriate for our students, but also one that's nurturing and really focuses on social emotional learning. And so, so the schedule that we have developed that we're in the process of developing for online learning has the opportunity for students to take more classes than you currently see on the schedule here for in-person learning. And so this is something that's in development, and it's something that will be fleshed out considerably more. But one of the things that we're looking at is having these long blocks of time being shared by multiple teachers. So you see in the schedule for in-person learning that there is a humanities period, and so that would be shared by 2 classes. But it may also and would likely include input from our teachers that might push into the class. Could be input from the culture and climate coordinator who might push into the class and do a socially distant circle or some sort of social emotional activity that would support students, because we realize that there's going to be a lot of things that students are learning this year, and there isn't any place in the state standards for the kinds of things they're going to be learning, which include this new environment of learning and being with one another in a socially distant space. And so we really want to create a lot of room and support for those things. So as Mike mentioned, the school day will start later, which will allow for students to be arriving later, but also allows for their teachers to have some time in the morning to be planning and organizing and getting things ready. So you see on this schedule on the slide, you see that the classes go through the year, and so that's one difference from the high school, and that's because we felt that it was important that students maintain and practicing the skill development over the course of the entire year, and we didn't feel it was appropriate for middle school students to be learning math for one semester and then to be dropping math in the other semester, because we're really cognizant of the fact that we're working on that skill development, and we don't want to be losing those opportunities to be reinforcing and building new skills. And so that's basically the organization of the in-person schedule, which is still very much under development. And again, the thing to remember that's most important is that it's a schedule that will be focused around giving students initially what is 1 day a week as an enriching environment that allows them to connect with their peers, for many of them for the first time in many months, and to do so in a way that is supported, that is enriching, and that is generally something that's helping to motivate them in their further learning when they're not in person.
Great, thank you. And I'll turn to Principal Sadiq to go over the high school draft schedule. And I want to just remind viewers, we're intentionally giving an overview of these schedules, as we will for the virtual schedules, because we really want to leave time for the question and the answer pieces. So we know we're answering some of the questions, but we want to make sure that we're opening things up in short order so that we can have more interactive dialogue. But Principal Sadiq?
Good morning, everybody. So quickly, so the high school schedule is based on a traditional block schedule where year-long classes are shortened and taught in one semester. The time on learning that would happen over the course of the year is happening over the course of the semester. So we have longer blocks, but only for half a year. Some of the reasons why we chose to do this are because to have fewer classes for students to focus on, because we learned from the spring that it was hard for them to juggle all 7 classes that were in their schedule in the past. So the beginning of the day, as Principal Sharon mentioned as well, we have the beginning of the day for teacher planning time. and then they'll have 3 classes during the school day. This schedule is going to start on September 16th, and it will be the same schedule throughout the whole year. So students won't have to switch schedules when we start in-person learning in November. It's going to be the same schedule. In the D block, you see at the bottom, that is the time we wanted to put in the schedule for students to access classes that couldn't necessarily fit into their 3x3 block schedule. A lot of that is going to be elective classes that they enjoy, some support classes. Again, this is still in the development phase, and we're trying to figure out exactly what is going to make the most sense to put in that D block. For right now, those are some of our main ideas. And the B period block is when lunch will happen. So if you look at the timing, there's time built in there for students to eat their lunch, teachers as well. And then also time for students to work on either some of their other distance learning classes or their classes when they're in person, or also to access supports or get extra help from teachers. I know there's going to be some questions. Again, I just want to kind of go over it quickly and then leave time for questions at the end.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Sadiq. The only thing I'll add is you see ensembles are up there, and the high school has been very deliberate at thinking about some of the courses that may have a harder time meeting in person, just given some of the health and safety requirements as well. And I appreciate the flexibility that our schools are taking on this this very challenging moment of thinking about what can work in school and what can't. Principal Slovin, do you want to walk us through Summit Academy with an overview?
Sure. So Summit Academy is a phase 1 school, and we originally put this together. It seems like years ago already, but a lot of what Talib, Principal Sadiq just talked about, we tried to put into our schedule. So we're a block schedule too, and but we also wanted to add some of the things that are unique to Summit Academy, and part of that is we haven't really put it in there, but D period, or our therapeutic time, which has advisories and clinical groups, was added. So you'll see that there's another period to the schedule. One of our major plans is to try to continually support students in their social emotional efforts to be in school in this new kind of way. And so you see a student check in, you see a student check out. Again, our in-person schedule and our virtual schedule are not exactly the same, and that's still being worked out because we want to be able to transition back from in-person to virtual and back and forth as easy as possible for students. So what we're trying to do, and just like in the other schedules, staff will be meeting early, and students will be coming in at 9. So a lot of the things that the other principals have said, we have included in our schedule. We agree that having less classes is extremely important, but most importantly, we want to support students where they're at and do it in a way that we can do it social distancing, but also do it in a very individual manner. So that's really important to us, that we are meeting students' needs individually, and that's how the schedule was created.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to note explicitly that you'll notice in all 3 schedules that students are taking fewer classes, and that's based on public health guidance. The idea of having fewer number of cohorts is something that's been recommended to us both nationally and statewide and locally. And so each school has a somewhat unique approach of how to do that. But the idea of mixing students, typically the middle school and high school, we had a 7-drop-1 schedule. So I mean, there were 6 different cohorts of students meeting throughout the day, and that's not consistent with the public health guidance we've received. We're very briefly.
Dr. Morris, I would add one thing for us.
Please.
Is that we as a group are really going to try to create quarters so that it will add up to semesters and it will be different, but all our classes add up to the credits that students need. But we're really going to break things down into quarters, which we think gives us more flexibility for students and gives them opportunity to earn credit in a certain way and also meet what they need specifically, even if MCAS comes along, that we'll be prepared for that as well.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Principal Slovin. So again, we're very briefly going to touch on some virtual schedules, which is again how the bulk of students will start their school at the secondary level. So I'll turn it back to Principal Sharon for just a brief overview of the distance or the remote learning schedule.
Thank you. So the schedule that we're developing for the middle school, which is very much still under development, is one that looks at the making sure that students have the opportunity to work on their 4 core subjects in a way that helps them to make strides and gain skills at this critical time in their development, but also gives them the opportunity to engage in supplemental exploratory courses that are enriching. And I'm sorry, Dr. Morris, do you have the slide up for that?
Oh, is it not? I thought it's on the bottom right side of the screen. Is it not showing?
Oh, yes, that's right. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Yeah.
And so the way the schedule is looking right now is that we're looking again at the time in the morning when students have the opportunity to get up and perhaps engage in some catching up or some planning at the same time that their teachers are together planning. But then there's an advisory period. One of the things we noticed in the spring was there were a number of students who we weren't able to account for in daily learning lessons. And so our advisory period in the morning is a quick check-in with an advisor cohort that allows students and in this small setting to engage in some sort of activity, some sort of sharing, but also a check-in that allows us to know who is engaged and who isn't. And that way we can communicate with families and do interventions that will support that. And then in the course of this student schedule, we see that there is a series of classes that are scheduled throughout the day. And this is not intended to be an asynchronous type of schedule. It's intended to be a schedule that the teachers will work with individually in order to ensure that there are opportunities throughout the week for the classes to meet both in a synchronous setting and also in an asynchronous setting. But these blocks of times are created so that students have the possibility of working within those time periods on those courses material, on the course material and the projects and those kinds of things. And there's also time allotted for a break for lunch. And even though, one of the comments that I've heard is that there isn't really time for breaks. It goes from 10:15 right to 10:15 and start up another class. And part of that is because these are tended to be slots for students to be working on things, some of which will be synchronous and others which won't. But in the course of a day, it's likely that a student wouldn't have synchronous class after another. So there would be actually time for breaks between those. These are just general frameworks of time to help students organize their time, because we feel it's really important for their executive functioning skills to be able to develop a rhythm that's supportive and keeps them in the habit of doing work on a daily basis. And there's also the opportunity, as I said, for exploratory and elective courses within that will be focused once again on providing enriching and social emotionally supportive activities for students to do with one another in groups and individually.
Yeah, and if I could add to that briefly, just to piggyback on what you said, it applies to all of our schools, is that we don't think it's in students' best interest to be on the computer straight in live classes for 5 or 6 hours a day. There's no research or evidence, and if you look at virtual schools, that's not how they're organized. It is the case that we will be expecting students to be present for their synchronous courses. Attendance will be taken, grades will be offered, so it's very different from last spring. But it may be that there's a short synchronous mini lesson and then time for students to work, and the teacher may be checking in with them in small groups. They may be writing something, submitting and getting feedback during that time, but it wouldn't be that English language arts would have a 45-minute synchronous lesson straight to math for 45 minutes, straight to exploratory. That there's no evidence or research that suggests that's a good path. But I also want to suggest that last spring we didn't have as much synchronous, and we got that feedback from students, from staff members and from families about the importance of making those personal connections and having direct instruction. And so it's trying to marry wanting students to have that direct instruction, maintain those strong relationships with peers and teachers and staff members, but not going 45-minute Google Meet to 45-minute Google Meet. That's not how virtual schools that have been doing this a long time set themselves up, and it's not how we would either. So just because of time, I'm gonna ask Mr. Sadiq and Mr. Slovin to just run through their virtual schedules. I think it's pretty smooth at the high school because it's so similar. But if you wouldn't mind doing that, and then we'll open it up for some question and answer.
Okay, yeah, the virtual schedule is intentionally the same as the in-person schedule. Students haven't been on a schedule for quite a while, and so we wanted to try to make it smooth. Everybody, my kids included, like the 9 o'clock start time better than 7:45 start time in the past. And so we'll keep that, and we wanted again to have the time for teachers to talk and to collaborate as well, because they're getting used to this different form of teaching and learning as well. But everything else is pretty much the same. Again, the D block is something we're still trying to figure out when to fit in during the day. So there'll be more information to come about that.
Thank you. And over to Principal Slovin.
Yeah, so here you see, and I'll just go very quickly, that 7:45 to 8:45, we've put in a synchronous and asynchronous supported learning. That's going to be students connecting with probably paraprofessionals that are directly connected with them, working on individual skills and class and homework, which is kind of great. But and we try to build in some screen breaks. We tried to make sure that, again, we had our B block. There is, which is for us is where we have our community meeting and therapeutic groups and directed support. And so I think it's pretty straightforward. This is different though than the in person, and that's something that we'd like to work out, because I'd like it to be closer related to the high school, and have so it's really possible that our in-person is going to look more like our virtual, but we're not yet there. So
right,
that's what I would say.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Ms. Consolino just for a quick update. She put together this really nice flyer, which is on our website, about things to do to prepare your student to return to school. It's certainly a lot of these things are talked about a lot, but I really appreciate Ms. Consolino's work to try to narrow it down to 10. So I don't know if you want to just walk us through some of the highlights, Ms. Consolino?
Sure. So like Dr. Morris said, this is available on the district's website for anybody to access at any time. And it just kind of goes over 10 quick pointers. There's a few that are important for the upcoming school year for parents to note. Couple that that I'll just kind of highlight is the immunizations and physicals. The state is not lightening up the requirements for immunizations going into the fall. So if you, now is the time to check with your primary care physician to see if your child is up to date with any of their immunizations. There's also a strong push for kids to get their flu shot this fall because the flu does mirror the coronavirus very similarly. And that was stressed as an important factor on last Wednesday's town hall with the physicians. If you have a child who has an asthma action plan, we're asking that if they have an aerosolized treatment to talk with your provider about changing that mode of medication administration, because we will not be doing nebulizer treatments or aerosolized treatments in school. Water fountains are going to be turned off in the district, and we will be using water fillers or water bubblers to fill water bottles. The district has purchased water bottles for every student in the district. And if you choose to send your child in with their own, but we will not be using water fountains to drink from a
right.
health
And I could add to that, Ms. Consolino, I think there are some schools that don't have as many bottle fillers. And so in those cases, we will be leaving the water fountains on, but only permitting the use based on the bottles, which I'll happy to share with you. I've got one right next to me, and after we're done with the slides, I'll show it off, but enough for purchase for everyone in the district.
And then a couple others. We will be asking families to screen their students in the morning, and we're going to be using an online platform to check in with the schools and to verify that your child is healthy. So my recommendation is to get a thermometer that's accurate. I am looking into a program that the district can, a national program to provide families with a thermometer, and it's an opt-in program, no cost to families. I'm just waiting for some information on that, and as soon as I get it, that'll be sent out to families. And then the other one, the biggie, number 9, is to make sure that your emergency contact information is up to date. If your child or your student is symptomatic with any COVID-like symptoms, they will be put in our medical waiting room, and they will be required to go home for the rest of the day. And we will require somebody to pick them up. And my intent is to have them picked up within a half hour to an hour's time frame. And then they will need to be evaluated by a physician. The guidance I have from the state right now is anybody with COVID symptoms will need to be evaluated and tested for COVID before the potential to be returned to school. And then the other ones, hand hygiene, practicing masks, which a lot of people are doing now anyways, the physical distancing, extra masks. We are asking families to provide masks or facial coverings for their students. We will have extras on hand just in case those become unusable during the school day. And then any extra information you need, there's links to our different websites on the school's replanning website. So any questions, you can send me an email or get it to Dr. Morris, and he can get a hold of me.
All right. So let me go back to our screen. And we've got a lot of questions. Sorry, I wasn't able to see it while I was displaying those. I'll show off our water bottles, thanks to Ms. Figueroa. So nice ARPS logo water bottles that they'll be in quite shortly. But I think I will turn it over to Ms. McDonald, who's going to help hopefully sort some of the comments that have come through, and we'll go from there. Oh, I think you're muted, Ms. McDonald. I'm sorry.
Classic mistake. There were a lot of questions early on about the high school schedule. I believe some of them Mr. Sadiq and Dr. Morris, you've already answered, but I'll ask them again. The questions about what's happening with D block and what that looks like. What's happening in between B and C block, which I believe is the lunch. And then also questions about what about quarter-long electives, and will they be offered in the fall as well as the spring, and how does that work?
Oh, before I'll give Mr. Sadiq a chance to think about that before he answers, I wanted to remind folks that if you are on Lexikey, in other words, you are accessing this material in a language that is different than the one we're speaking, you can put a question in the chat there in your whatever language is the most comfortable for you, and it'll be translated, and they will upload it into the comments. So I just wanted to, if you're watching and not sure if that will work, there are translators available, and they'll translate it and put it on the chat. So I'm sorry, Mr. Sadiq, but I just wanted to, I was reminded to share that, and I forgot earlier. So.
All right. So the D block question, I tried to answer it before. This is kind of a vague answer to the question because we haven't completely figured out how it's going to work. We know we want to have an extra block during the day where students can access, electives or support classes, ensembles. So it's going to be flexible. I believe we'll have a mixture like the regular classes of synchronous and asynchronous time, maybe mostly asynchronous, and then a scheduled synchronous time for feedback and check-ins from the teacher running the D-block class. And we'll provide more clarity about that once we get closer to finalizing our schedule. With the electives, so they are going to be run in quarter blocks, so half of a semester long. They will be offered in the fall and in the spring. So let's say an A period, if they have math A period, and maybe B period, the first half of the semester, they'll have, say, an art elective, and then maybe a second for 8 or 9 weeks. And then that second 8 or 9 weeks of the first semester, they could have, a different elective, maybe music production video production type of class. And then in their C block, they would have their English class that whole semester. And it'd be the same thing in the spring, of course, different core classes, maybe a world language, a science class, and the semester-long blocks, and then 2 other electives during one of the 3 blocks. And the time in between, you saw in B period, that hour-long, it's an hour and 10-minute period that's not accounted for in that schedule. That is the time when we're in person, 10-minute transition period, and also a half hour for lunch, and then half hour for it's almost built in like directed study, a study hall type of period, again, for students to work either on their current A, B, or C period classes, or to check in with their D period teacher, or a time for them to take a break and do something that's not disturbing other folks, similar to a regular study hall. Not sure if those were all the questions.
I believe so. I think so. The quarter-long courses also applies to, the 11th and 12th grade English that are semester-long courses. Would they follow the same approach as the semester-long electives?
That's a good question. So there are, along with the quarter-long English classes, there are also the 12th grade social studies electives that were also a semester long. So what the English department head and also the social studies department have been talking to the departments and combining those to make them a full semester class, a combination of different English classes will make up the one semester. So there'll be journalistic writing and African American Lit will be combined in a way to give the students a full semester long worth of English, but it's going to be obviously look a little different than it did in the past, but it's going to be combined to be one semester long, and similar with social studies. And when we finalize all this, we're going to send out the schedules, we'll send out also an explanation of how they were combined and sort of the process of converting students' current elective choices into their schedule. So it'll be a lot clearer once we send it all out and everything's finalized.
Ms. McDonald, so there was a couple questions I'd like to address in terms of public health metrics. Something that I saw last week is that the state came out with a different set of metrics, and they're no longer reporting things that the New York Times is easily picking up on a day-to-day basis, particularly as it relates to number of cases per 100,000, which is one of the common metrics. They're releasing it. What we're planning to do is every Wednesday now they're releasing town-by-town metrics. And for Hampshire and Franklin County, we're collecting all 46 cities and towns in Hampshire and Franklin County, and we'll calculate those numbers on Wednesday nights. So the New York Times is no longer, unfortunately, it's not their fault, but it's no longer the viable resource for tracking this. It's really Wednesday evening, and it's on the mass.gov website. They release town-by-town information. It's a little cumbersome because you have to pull it off and make an Excel file of those 46 towns. We have a pretty good system for it now to be able to do it relatively quickly, but I saw some comments around that. And right now, the health metrics in Western Massachusetts, particularly in our area, remain well under the metrics that we selected. Again, those metrics were the Harvard Global Health Institute's metrics. They're more stringent than the CDC and the World Health Organization and places like New York State, but we want to be as conservative as we can be with metrics, and that was the most conservative metrics we found from a reputable place working with epidemiologists, and that's what we did. So I wanted to, share that. I think, I also want to thank our state representative has been very active in trying to get us countywide data more readily, and she's continuing to work on that. So I want to thank her. She's been in touch with us really often, and, I definitely appreciate that part. I think there's a couple questions about sports. At this point, it's and Mr. Spee can definitely jump in if he wants, but it's sort of complicated who makes which decision. Right now, we don't have a decision from the MIAA, which is the Massachusetts Interscholastic, Athletics Association, something like that. They're typically the governing body for sports, nor from DESE, which is where we would typically get them. We did get some guidance for youth sports that may apply, but we don't have a final answer yet on sports. It was one of these things that was promised to us, I think, Mr. Sadiq, 2 weeks ago, something like that. And I think there's looking at other states, they're starting to come out with it, but as numbers change, I think they're still being still waiting for that piece. We are still using Google and Google Classroom. Google Meet has been upgraded this year, and it's already working much better in terms of sound quality, and more features are coming soon. And its security, for us, the biggest thing is the security protocols continue to be dramatically better than the competitors in the marketplace. Trying to scroll down questions. I don't know if there were some that you were planning to ask, Ms. McDonald.
There were a couple questions about what the one day in person would be used for at the middle school and the high school. And then related to that, what happens for students who are choosing fully remote learning throughout the year, what will happen for them on the one day that in person? I think that was a question for both Mr. Sadiq and Mr. Sharon.
Well, I can certainly speak to the plans for the middle school with regard to that. So the one-day instruction, the one-day in-person instruction day, as I mentioned earlier, is really meant to be a day where students have the opportunity to begin to connect or reconnect with their school, their peers, and in-person learning. And it's really meant to be a day that's social and emotionally supportive. It's meant to be a day that gives students the opportunity to practice being in proximity with one another, even social distance. And it's also meant to be a support for online, for the remote learning that's happening the rest of the week. And so it's not meant to necessarily be a heavy instruction day. It's meant to be a day where students have the opportunity to learn and to get support on some of their learning in person, perhaps in a socially distanced classroom, with instructions being offered from the front of the room by a teacher, and explanations on a whiteboard and those kinds of things. But a different kind of learning than what they're used to, and so it's gonna be changing for families who have their children or choose to have their children remote for the entire week. They will still be maintaining their weekly remote schedule, and so there will be times that they're scheduled for doing coursework in different classes, and for that one day, they will just be they will maintain the same class schedule, they'll maintain the same learning load, but for that one day, they will be not involved with the same kinds of physical activities and in-person activities that their peers are. But it'll be a smooth and easy thing that'll be seamless for them in terms of their actual engagement in the academic program.
Yeah, the high school version of the one day a week in person is very similar to the middle school. Realize our main focus was really trying to get the distance learning really solid. We learned from the spring that it was a challenge for a lot of folks. So the in-person, as Principal Sharon alluded to, it's going to be it's not going to be a heavy instructional day. It'll be a lot of teacher check-ins, students being able to be in a room together, socializing. And then a lot of feedback on the distance learning activities that they had done. For those students who remain in distance learning, those days will be majority asynchronous teaching, but they'll still, as Principal Sharon alluded to, they'll have their same schedule, but it'll be an asynchronous day for them. And they'll have times, the other days of the week when everybody is remote will be when the synchronous remote learning will happen.
This is probably a quick question, and there's a few questions about how and when textbooks would be handled.
I can take this one. Thank you for all the people bringing in Chromebooks today, even. So we're collecting them because they need to be updated, much like your phone and any other device. These days, there needs to be updating of devices, and then there also will be a pickup. And as opposed to last spring, where our schools were really off limits given the situation, this fall we'll be able to have pickup of Chromebooks, and with that pickup of textbooks and other materials. So we'll be able to do a little more than what we were able to do last year as it relates to that. And I think that'll really help the distance learning so that students have access to a greater set of materials. It'll still be structured, it'll still be organized and done in a way consistent with public health guidance, but there will be an opportunity for students to have their textbooks and have their materials to support their distance learning.
Okay. There's a few different questions regarding changes throughout the school year, whether students will be able to add or drop classes, whether they're in person or remote, and whether they can switch between a full remote decision for the fall and an in-person in the spring.
Yeah, and so I tried to answer that a little on the chat, but moving from virtual to in-person, we're looking at people making decisions that last at least a quarter because of the public health implications. We may have 14 or 15 students in class. There may not be a seat that is readily available, and we can't flip sections very quickly. But the other way around could happen anytime. So for students who are taking in person, they can flip to virtual for any reason, anytime. And some of that's just going to happen. When students are out sick, we want them to have access to some of the courses and mini lessons so that they don't fall behind. And this actually has some potential advantages around some flexibility with that. We know that students, if they even have symptoms, and it may most of the time may end up being a cold or the flu, they're going to need to stay out, as Ms. Consolino said, until they get tested. And while we're lucky in Western Massachusetts that our testing capacity is in very good shape and the turnaround time is much better than, frankly, horror stories that we hear from other parts of the country, we still don't want students losing learning during that time. So there's a lot of flexibility from the in-person to virtual, much more rigid from the virtual to in-person, and looking at the quarters as logical times for families to be able to reconsider that decision.
Okay. Forgive me if you've also already answered this. I'm scrolling through all of the questions here, but there are a few questions regarding special ed and the priority groups, what their in-person learning might look like versus virtual learning. And I see Faye has joined, Ms. Brady has joined us.
So thank you for those questions. And the personnel in the programs are developing the schedules for those students whose family choose for them to be in person for their learning as they are prioritized for phase 1. And the schedule will include their special education instruction and services, as well as the ability for those students to access if they're scheduled to be in an academic class or a general education class that is still being offered remote, they will be able to access those. So we are planning on kind of a large amount of spaces available so that we can have students be able to access whatever class it is that they have in their schedule and in their IEP. I think the most important thing that I'd like families to know is that the planning for a student's special education and instruction and services will all be guided by their IEP. So hopefully that answers all those questions.
There was an earlier question also about students that are new to the district this school year. Will they have opportunities to meet teachers and peers?
So, I mean, I don't know if one of the principals will take it. I mean, I can say that this is where it gets a little tricky with the public health. So they absolutely will, but I think when we think about the ways by which we used to introduce new students, oftentimes those ways are less accessible now. unfortunately, given the public health guidance, that is kind of the core of what we won't bend on. So I do think there's opportunities for that to happen. What we know is that so far, even for our phase 1 families, we have the majority of students suggesting or telling us that they'll return, and some students won't. So I do think for students who are new, it is going to be a different environment, and I think there will be more openness towards that because everything is going to be a little different. It's not going to be exactly what we were doing on March 13th in the morning. Lots has changed in the world, lots has changed locally, and lots has changed for children. So I think all students will feel like they're new students because they're going to have to learn the new protocols and ways they can connect. So I do think in some ways, oddly, there will be an opportunity for all students to have a reset. And if they're new, they'll be part of that experience. So I see there's a couple questions, Ms. McDonald, if I could, about when people can expect to get schedules and that sort of thing, knowing that school is starting later, virtual or in person, not till the 16th. So I don't know if any of the principals are able to talk a little bit about what they're thinking about in terms of timeline for those types of things, knowing that it's a new schedule. And I want to be really clear, too, before you answer, that this is also part of negotiating. We're meeting with our labor unions, and especially at the secondary level, any schedule does need to be bargained. And we're working on that with our labor unions. But just any sense on a timeline?
So I can start. So as Dr. Morris alluded to, there are a lot of things that still need to be worked out. So we're hoping to have them out to families in the first week of September, because we have to make the schedules, and then we have to meet with guidance counselors and special ed folks to make sure that everybody is getting everything they need in terms of graduation credits, along with and trying to fit as many of their requests into this shortened block schedule. So we're shooting for the first week of September.
I would just echo that. That's the timeline for the middle school is we're wanting to be able to push out schedules to families and to students by the end of that first week. So I think that's that would be September 4th, which is when we're hoping to make sure to have schedules out to parents.
We're shooting for the that first week too, but it's all variable related. Obviously, our seniors and juniors, that's critical that we make sure that the schedule fits in what exactly they need to graduate to move forward, and so that's how we'll become developing of that. But variables around students are going to be up in the air, as well as what you talked about, negotiations.
Dr. Morris, I'm seeing a couple questions about the metrics and timing of bringing students back into the schools. So I think that's getting at our phasing plan decision. So
yeah,
I'm happy to talk if you want to start.
Yeah, so there's a couple about the state system that started last week and why we aren't perhaps utilizing that one. And I think I'm glad the state is taking on a more proactive approach towards that. I think the challenge is 3 of our communities, for instance, Pelham, Hubbard, and Shutesbury, will almost always be white on the map because they're so small they don't actually show up. And about 2/3 of the state continues to be that way. In Amherst, some of the metrics are also hard to compile because we don't actually know how many students are going to be living here. It's a very different year. The other thing we know is that when we look at town by town, I know I grew up in a different state, and counties were like the metric that the unit that you would look at. And I think there's some value there, especially for some of these small communities. There's a small community near us, not in our district, that went from 0% positive, they had no cases, to 7% because they had 2 cases in 1 week, back to 0. And so it's very, very sensitive for small communities. It's also the case that, again, in Amherst, when you're doing per 100,000, we don't know what our student population is. So we think that the metrics that are being recommended at places like Cambridge, although their numbers are higher, they're less stringent than ours, that are looking at multiple counties end up being a more reliable data source. Many of us live, we have a school choice population. You know, when many of us live right next to, you know, there's a 3-town run that I go on between Amherst, Belchertown, and Pelham, and you know, our borders are porous, right? There's not gates up that separate us. So thinking about the 95% of students who live in probably more than that even, who live in Hampshire and Franklin County, and while not as high, the bulk of staff who live in those places, it felt like a regional approach like New York State is using is the best one. And I think in terms of phasing, it wasn't exclusively because of our metrics or our numbers. It was really easing in to make sure our systems were in place, that we were able to manage and actively support students when they return, instead of moving quicker than we felt like we could accommodate. We again tried to look at the students with the least amount of access to distance learning, who often struggle the most in the spring. I know it's really disappointing because right now I agree with some of the commenters. Our metrics are really low, you know, which is great, that we don't have the same challenges. And, you know, we want to make sure we get robust distance learning off to a great start at the secondary level. It'll look a lot different than it did in the spring. And then easing students in. You know, with the 6-foot distancing, it means that we can't fit our students in the middle school and high school. So the idea of a full return to middle school and high school with 6-foot distancing isn't mathematically possible. We've measured it out. And again, about 15 desks or so, depends on the room, is as much as we can fit in. And that's quite a bit less than what our typical class size is at the middle school and high school. So, you know, we know there are other metrics, you know, in my personal opinion and conversation we had last week with the school committee, we feel really comfortable that we're moving forward with metrics that has a regional approach that is inclusive of a larger quantity of people. And the way we know community spread works, we may not need to be worried as acutely as what happens in Georgia or even in the Boston area. But in terms of Hampshire and Franklin County, the towns are very small, and looking at it in the aggregate gives us a better read on what's really happening in terms of community spread.
Thank you. There is a question from the middle school about will there still be teaching teams? Will they still be on teams? And then also sort of related about Math Flex for 7th graders.
Yes, so actually the teaching teams are a really critical part of the middle school and how we're organizing our instruction. One of the things we're depending on is trying to create interdisciplinary models that allow teachers in certain disciplines to teach together, so that there's less actual, it appears to students that there would be less actual classes that they're working with, and more of an opportunity to take a STEM class instead of a math and science class, for example, or taking a humanities class instead of having a separate English and separate social studies class. So that's still very much a part of how we're working, and yes, students will be in teams, and teachers will be organized into teams as well. In terms of the Math Flex model and how that's worked in the past, it's actually something that we're looking at changing a little bit, and we're currently having pretty intensive discussions with the math department in order to try and look at how we can better adapt to the needs of our students and our community with regard to that. And that's something that that is still in process, but the 8th grade, the math program won't be changing for the 8th grade. We're looking at the possibility of doing away with the way it had been in the past, and looking at a more heterogeneous math grouping in the 7th grade this year, and allowing other math electives or math special courses like the geometry portfolio class to still exist for students who are seeking those opportunities as well.
I believe scrolling through the questions on the question about 6 feet versus 3 feet. That was a school committee decision and direction based on all of the guidance that we've seen from public health professional organizations such as the CDC, the WHO, Harvard's Chan Institute of Public Health, and other sources. And that is, so yes, the answer is the school committee.
we are at just about 10 o'clock, so I'm just scrolling up to see. I think you answered the team's question. I think there's some questions. If the metrics stay good, would we be looking to accelerate the phasing? At this point, that's not in the plan, but again, that's feedback, and I'll put in the comment, or maybe Sasha or Debbie can, that people can always email me at morrism.arps.org, excuse me, or the school committee as school committee, one word, at arps.org. That's not in the current plan, but certainly if there's feedback or thoughts that you have around kind of policy level decisions, that would be the best people to communicate and share your viewpoints. So there's a question, Mr. Sharon, about, I assume that this is 8th grade teams. There was some work done to look at how the 7th grade teams were working and perhaps make some modifications to those teams in 8th grade. So I don't know if you have specifics to share on that particular thing, different than the larger question about teams.
Yeah, so there were some changes made to last year's 7th grade teams in preparation for this year, and those teams were really we're trying to get better and more pedagogically appropriate balancing in terms of those teams. And so we felt it was important if we were going to be switching some students around, because of course the value of teams is that students have the opportunity to see familiar faces in their instructional staff from 7th grade to 8th grade. And so we also made a few changes and changed some teachers around, and so students will be able to have some of their teachers be the same teachers regardless of what team they ended up on. But so yeah, there were some changes made in trying to make groups that were better balanced and between the two teams, and we worked on that quite a bit this year with a number of teachers, and really trying to look at those groupings being equitable across the board. And those are some changes that will be included in the schedules when they're received this year. But again, not only students but also some teachers were moved around so that all students will be able to have some familiar faces in the 8th grade.
Trying to think if we missed any. I know it's 10:02, so I want to be conscious of that.
While you're looking at that, I'll just remind folks the email the superintendent at morrism.arps.org or school committee at schoolcommittee@arps.org. There's also a lot of information, including a lot of past slides, the draft schedules, the flyer from Ms. Consolino, as well as these slides will be posted there as well on the arps.org website. If you go to the fall 2020 planning subsite, that's where you'll find all of these materials.
Yep, and I saw a couple more that maybe we can close with. Really good question, and if I missed it, I apologize. I know everyone's touched on it about, and I'm going to get Dr. Brady back on here, about social emotional programming for students. It's timely because the administrative team is having a session on that tomorrow. And I wondered certainly if you could start, and then anyone certainly can jump in and add to that. But I think it's a critical question. I appreciate it because what we know is that this has been an incredibly difficult experience for all of us, parents and children and families and caregivers, and that we really do need to think a little differently about the social emotional supports that students will need upon return, whether it's in a virtual and in-person environment.
Sure. So I'm glad that people are asking those questions because it's in the forefront of our minds. And I think we were grateful towards the end of last year that we had a planning group with a variety of personnel who created some guidelines for us to utilize in this planning. And as schools were developing their schedules, and I think Principal Sharon spoke to this directly, that we wanted to make sure there was time in each schedule that specific, explicit attention to meeting the needs and addressing the social emotional needs of our students as they transition back into school. One of the things that we are still actively talking about is what that will look like, especially in the first several weeks of school. That although there's academics in the schedule, I think all the teachers are aware that without acknowledging and addressing how to support the students and their social emotional needs, just moving straight into academics will not be productive. So I would say when I think of things as kind of a concentric circle, I think of the social emotional work and meeting the needs of all of our young people is has to be the large lens, and then everything else that we do, whether it's a math lesson, an ELA lesson, will be within the context of that. So as Dr. Morris said, we are going to be working with our administrative team as to how to lead that in the most effective way so that we can be communicating that to all teachers so we don't lose sight of that as a primary.
Yeah. I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer. So I think the last question, and again, if it was answered and I missed it, I apologize, but Mr. Sadiq, this came up at some of the live town halls we did over the last couple of weeks too about college counseling. And I don't know if you could share that information, because I know it was really helpful for folks to hear when we were doing some of the live versions of this.
Right, so we have a great college and career counselor, Ms. Deidre Gray. So the plan is to have, again, some synchronous and asynchronous work that she'll be doing. Also, try our best to open up the building to help to have time for students to come in and receive in-person help getting through some of the application processes that they go through in order to move on to college or prepare for life after high school. So again, it's not completely set yet, but the plan is to have a combination of those three: synchronous, asynchronous, and in-person help in the beginning, early fall, all the way through the first semester, and trying to help students really prepare for life after high school.
Yeah, thank you. And I think something I added to Mr. Sadiq's comment at those events, and I'll add here, is last spring, if you remember, we all felt so incredible amount of empathy for our graduating seniors. And we always, there was so many comments of like, this is the hardest thing to be a graduating senior during this time and have the last spring of your school experience be reduced in terms of the in-person and all the events that students weren't able to do, and the athletics, the spring season, and prom, and even graduation, well, I think went well, was very different. And so we all want to say that, you know, we acknowledge that, particularly for rising junior and really for rising seniors, they've been in this for a while, and it's incredibly difficult to think through what the implications are. And that's why, you know, Ms. Duffy Gray, which Mr. Sadiq mentioned, Cuffy Gray, which Mr. Sadiq mentioned, we're all really dedicated to making this work as best as possible, and with particular attention focused on that population. The two other things I want to share is what's next. We are, as we mentioned, in bargaining with our bargaining units, our unions, and so when things get finalized, we'll be able to share those out. But we have to be a little cautious, even in terms of how much is synchronous. We can say very clearly the state is expecting us directly in all states, all districts in Massachusetts, to have direct synchronous instruction on a routine, regular basis, and that's really different from what occurred in the spring. So people will see a difference within that. Attendance will be taken. Those types of things and structures in PowerSchool will exist much more similarly to they did in the past. But we'll be able to share more clarity as that process concludes. I want to give Ms. Richardson, who's our ELL coordinator, there weren't specific questions that came, but I do want to give her just a quick minute to talk about some of the services and supports that we're thinking about for some of our ELL students.
Hi. So I guess there's a lot to think about, of course, and similar to special education, but looking from a really different lens, we'll be looking to support English learners in, as always, building their language acquisition, as well as accessing core content of all the classes that they need to participate in. So for our phase 1 students, we're looking to invite them to school so that we can do more intensive English language development, because we know that to provide the services that we're really being asked to provide, by the Department of Education at the level of engagement that we'd like to see for language development, we do really feel that there's a strong benefit for that to be in person. Certainly families will have the option to choose that or not, but there's a different kind of support level that's available with staff and translation and all of the pieces that we need to make sure that they're getting the instruction. And then also to be able to access, for example, a math class and get the support. So even if they are participating in a class remotely, that they're with a cohort and a team that's really supportive of making sure that that content becomes accessible to them. That's something that we do, work really intensively with our staff and collaborate across departments to do when we are in person, and we need to find ways to replicate that. So as much as possible, we'll be doing that with our beginner students as we transition back. And then certainly we'll be looking for what are the extra kinds of supports that we can provide in collaboration for remote learning between our English learner education teachers as well as our content teachers. So that's just a brief overview.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson. I appreciate it. And I know this is getting translated and actually recorded. So people, if you are watching this and someone couldn't make it, this same link you're watching on for the English version will go on indefinitely or be available indefinitely. And we're recording the ones in different languages so we can be proactively sharing that out with families for whom English is not their primary language. So 10:11, so we did pretty well on time. I'm going to put Dr. Brady back on. I think there's a specific question about 504 plans, and this will be our last one. And who would be the coordinator for 504 plans at the high school level? Either actually Dr. Brady or Mr. Sadiq might be able to answer that question.
So I can start, and then Mr. Sadiq, jump in if there's something different than what I say. But that will not change from during the school year. So typically at the high school, the guidance counselor will be monitoring and developing any changes to 504 plans, and that will continue. And I think it is important to note that the plans for 504 will continue to be shared with teachers, and the modifications or interventions that are indicated on that plan will continue during this time of remote instruction. So, Mr. Sadiq, anything to add to that?
I think you did a good job, Dr. Brady.
Very good. Well, again, thank you. Thank you for all the kind comments that have come through in the chat. We really appreciate you coming in to watch this, and we do really encourage you to, for people who couldn't attend at this time, that this link, again, will be accessible indefinitely, and to be in touch with us as more questions emerge. We're about a month out from the first day of school, and that's we're in a really different place. Usually we'd be thinking about school starting much sooner and not having as many significant changes. But the thing I want to share publicly is just how strong our team is, and that's been really critical for all of our secondary schools and central office. And Rupert Roy Clark's not on here, but he does our facilities work, and he's been at it, as well as other people, assistant principals and others who have been at it. We really appreciated the feedback. We know we've given so many surveys, we've gotten some critique of survey fatigue, but we're going to keep doing that because we want to continue to hear from the community about the best plan moving forward and how to best support their children. And so thank you. It's again 10:15, so we'll end it here. More questions, please do follow up with us an email, and thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.